Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds.
Recently, I asked Mint Mobile's legal team if big wireless companies are allowed to raise prices due to inflation. They said yes. And then when I asked if raising prices technically violates those onerous two-year contracts, they said, "What the f*** are you talking about, you insane Hollywood ass?" So to recap, we're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month.
Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
This episode is brought to you by LifeLock. The new year brings new health goals and wealth goals. Protecting your identity is an important step. LifeLock monitors millions of data points per second. If your identity is stolen, LifeLock's restoration specialist will fix it, guaranteed or your money back. Resolve to make identity health and wealth part of your New Year's goals with LifeLock. Save up to 40% your first year. Visit LifeLock.com/podcast. Terms apply.
Today on CityCast Boise, the 2025 legislative session officially begins today, so we're talking with the city's lobbyist about the key issues Boise faces, from housing to clean energy and autonomy. How does the city plan on defending its values while advocating for residents against state-level overreach? It's Monday, January 6th. I'm Lindsay Van Allen, and this is what Boise's talking about. I'm chatting with Kathy Grismeyer. She's the Director of Policy and Government Affairs with the City of Boise. Thanks for being here, Kathy.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited for today's conversation.
I'm really curious, just really jumping in your perspective, what are the biggest challenges that Boise faces as we head into the 2025 legislative session?
Sure. I think like any other entity that spends time at the State House during the legislative session, coming in, it's a new session, a bunch of new lawmakers. It's really just getting lawmakers and elected officials acquainted with the city of Boise. What are the issues that we're facing, really in service to our shared constituents? If you have a mayor and a council member and you also have state lawmakers that represent you as a Boise resident, that folks have an understanding about what our residents need and then what efforts we're taking on behalf of our residents.
And do you find that elected officials and legislators and those at the State House are receptive to that messaging, or does that take some work and really building inroads?
When you're able to get a lawmaker and meet with them one-on-one and really talk about the issue at hand, there's an opportunity for understanding, really for bridge building. I think irrespective of the politics at play, political party affiliation, there's a recognition that government is here to serve people and provide a service, and working to really help lawmakers understand we have a community that voted in a mayor, we have a community that voted in our council members, and they have been tasked with meeting the community's needs, and the legislature sometimes has a role to play in helping ensure that those programs and services can come to fruition. And so working together in tandem with them to help remind them that that is the case and that is the expectation that our residents have. And if they're not able to get it at the local level, then they will be seeking that program or that service at the state level.
Yeah, because, I mean, you lightly touched on this, but some legislators have been very open about their disdain for Boise and have painted it as this liberal enemy in this red state. Do you think that colors how the legislature views the city, or is that more of a fringe perspective?
I would say that's more of a fringe perspective, and I think myself and the contract lobbyists that the city utilizes to be at the State House to represent our really diverse set of issues we're working on, we really spend the time to help folks understand, do some myth busting, provide more information. Then I think as we get through that, maybe that hard partisan stance kind of goes away. Easier said than done, I think, on an individual level, but it's something I know our government affairs team here really strives to do. Again, because at the end of the day, we've got services to provide and to protect, and we want to maintain open lines of communication and working relationships with lawmakers to be able to get that work done.
Okay, Kathy, I'm super curious. What are some of the myths that you've had to bust at the State House?
Probably the biggest one early on was that we just had a huge pile of money the city was just stockpiling. And in some part, that was a lot of education about previous administrations, budgets and funds. A lot of that was related to the previous library project and how that money was getting redirected to deferred maintenance or other programs. So some myth busting about the amount of money the city had, how we were utilizing it, and what were our plans moving forward. And so a lot of really in-depth conversations about what city budgets look like, how they're being financed, property tax relief for residents, which is an important issue. So a lot to do around around that perspective.
And Boise is the largest city in the state and has, we have the state's largest university. We're home to several global companies. We're what I would say the cultural hub of the state is. Why don't you think that translates into more sway at the State House?
That is a great question. And in my opinion, and doing this work, having been at the State House for a number of years, and this will be my 5th session with the city, unfortunately, I do think it's the partisan politics that come into play that it's not something the city is bringing to the table at the legislature. It's something we're having to really respond to, work to navigate, and remind folks that the income tax that's raised here in the city of Boise from all of these companies goes into the state budget, that the sales tax and liquor tax that's generated out of the city from our small businesses, our large businesses, the events and cultural events that people like to come to go into the state budget. That then helps offset things like roads or water infrastructure or, other important provisions that the state has a responsibility to fund. Is coming off of a thriving economy here in Boise. And I think when we work to remind lawmakers that what's good for Boise is good for the state, there's a recognition it helps to work together because Boise doing well from an economic standpoint means the state is able to do well and finance many of its interests and priorities as well too.
So when you're talking to these legislators, do you bring up like, hey, Boise has this much tax revenue that we're bringing to the state? Do you have those numbers for them? Or is that a conversation you're having with these legislators?
That is a great question, and it's certainly a data point that I would love to be able to point to. Unfortunately, right now, the Tax Commission does not track by zip code where they're generating income tax or sales tax revenue. And so I would imagine that the zip codes attached to Boise, you would see pretty significant income tax, sales tax, liquor tax revenue being generated out of Boise area zip codes to really back up the numbers. And I think the general understanding that Boise's really healthy economy is really helping finance a number of state programs and priorities.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty basic data point that would be very influential in perhaps softening that relationship between Boise and the legislature when you see, how much tax revenue, all of this revenue that's being generated by the city and how it supplements what's happening in the state.
Correct. And I think, too, we've talked about it a lot as it relates to property tax legislation in previous years. The city has been very supportive of appropriate relief mechanisms for residential homeowners, recognizing, several years ago, and even now, I think there's still a lot of pain points around owning your home and property taxes really going up. At the same time, too, though, the largest revenue source for municipal governments is property tax revenue. And so those are the things that we need to ensure that we have clean water, that we have roads, not here in Boise. That's, managed through ACHD and its own property tax generation. But for other cities, parks programs, things of that nature, those are all infrastructure investments that cities are responsible for making that do make it feasible and viable for business to invest in a particular community so that businesses can thrive, that their workforce can have, safe communities to live in and safe spaces for their children to grow up in. It all works together. And again, at the end of the day, what's good for Boise is good for the state. What's good for other local communities is good for the state too. And so we have to remember that they have to work together.
So keeping that in mind, Kathy, what are the bills and policy initiatives that could affect Boise that you're watching closely this session?
big picture, anything related to housing is something. Housing remains a top priority for the mayor and council here in Boise. So anything that touches housing is something that we're going to really closely follow, whether it's the state decides to make additional investments in the Workforce Housing Trust Fund, which is something we've been supportive of. That would certainly be a big boost in helping developers be able to have the math pencil out to do more affordable housing development below market rate, which is really a large need in the city. Anything that looks to expand state tax credits or tax exemptions also to incentivize affordable housing would be a huge boost here in the city. Idaho is one of either 4 or 5 states that doesn't provide any sort of state level tax credit or tax exemption that developers usually pair with a federal tax credit. And so being able to have some additional financial tools on the table for developers to take advantage of would be nice to see. Anything that impacts renters or people who are unhoused will be something the city will very closely watch, just knowing that there remains a lot of need. The city's doing as much as it can with the limited resources it has, and again, hopes to see the state be a partner in that space. Transportation, I think, is going to be a big one. I think we'll see a lot of conversations about what happens with ACHD and how that might impact Boise's roads and streets. And then I think, unfortunately, I'm hearing a lot of really hateful rhetoric around immigrants, members of the LGBTQ community, other marginalized community groups. And Boise is a community that really prides itself on being a community for everyone and really working to protect community members, organizations, and partner groups that serve those communities. And so we'll be watching very closely to see what those impacts on that type of legislation might have here in Boise.
So after the last legislative session, would you say you're mostly focused on trying to stop bills that could potentially derail Boise's priorities? Or do you have specific bills that you would like to see go forward outside of maybe ones for developers?
Sure. I think we do spend most of our time playing defense, unfortunately. And so working to respond to legislation that would restrict the city's authority or would restrict a program that the city that's really closely attached to one of our main priorities. We are working on one proactive piece of legislation around our geothermal system. The city of Boise manages and operates the largest geothermal system in the country, which is really exciting. And we're running into some issues around how we're able to grow and expand that system. There's been a lot of interest with some partner entities in the downtown core who are interested in connecting to our geothermal system or continuing to expand their current access. So not to get too technical, but really looking at addressing some water rights issues as it relates to the geothermal system, mostly in response to the drive that we're getting from businesses who want to be able to connect to a local, natural, renewable resource that we're really happy to grow and develop here in the city.
Yeah, looking towards renewable energy, renewable resources, climate change is one of the topics that the city and mayor have prioritized, but the legislature has really shown no interest in addressing. How has this misalignment of priorities affected progress on these initiatives, or has it?
I would say the biggest area where we've seen there's been some really big conflict has actually been in the administrative rules process around energy codes and efficient energy codes and building development. All cities have essentially been preempted from adopting any sort of local building code around energy efficient standards that exceed what's outlined at the state level. That has been really hard throughout the last presidential administration, given how much money had been included in the infrastructure bill and the Inflation Reduction Act around adopting the most recent standard of energy efficient building codes. It's money that the city would have loved to take advantage of. It's a standard and a practice and a value, really, that we hold, but because of state law, we're preempted from doing so. I do think on our end, kind of broadly in the climate space, it's not one that the legislatures really dove into, but really working to communicate with lawmakers that in many ways, much of our climate work is about supporting the green economy. It's about ensuring we have a workforce that's ready for where the markets are going to go moving forward, and really being able to respond to what companies are wanting and what they're needing, and helping them understand that it's an economic issue, regardless of how they might feel about the words climate change.
I think that's a really good perspective, that maybe focusing, or maybe a good strategy that you mentioned, focusing on this is businesses are wanting this. It's in demand. This is something that we can do to move forward. When Boise does well, the state does well.
Correct. We want to just make sure that the economy is future-proofed, while also recognizing that Boiseans and I think Idahoans, very broadly speaking, care a lot about natural resources, about public land preservation, about the outdoors, recreating. And so how can we blend those two interests in a way that's good for residents, but good for business too?
And the state legislature has shown a pattern of preempting local regulations, like with House Bill 545 that targeted Boise's renter protections. So how much does this trend affect Boise's capacity to govern effectively on matters of local concern?
When you restrict local governments from being able to respond to these like really unique local issues, they take a problem solver, a stakeholder out of the equation. And then where are they left to turn to for support and assistance? And so House Bill 545 is a really great example. We had enacted a number of protections for renters in Boise. Those protections had gone into effect January 1st of 2024. By the time the legislature had wrapped, those tenant protections were nullified and preempted. And in a lot of our conversations with lawmakers, many of whom, they're on committees outside of Boise. So we're having to do a lot of education about this might not be an issue in your community, but it's a really large one here, and one that the mayor and council are really trying to respond and create answers that are localized. We've worked with stakeholders to try and address the issue. If you take this ability away for this city to respond, are you going to step into this space? Are you prepared to enact tenant protections? Are you prepared to respond to low availability for renters? Are you ready to respond to high rent costs? Are you able to respond to unscrupulous business practices that some landlords might be enacting to take advantage of the moment? If you're not, then you really should empower local governments to be at the front lines of responding to this. And instead, now we'll just have to encourage our residents to really go to their elected leaders at the state level and share those issues, because we have been severely restricted in how we're able to respond in a way that's meaningful for our residents, but also is in line with the statutory allowances we now have.
And do you think that that's potentially another issue at play here? That's not just that Boise is this blue dot in a red state, but it's also this urban area in what is largely a very rural state. Do you think that that affects legislators' ability to understand or recognize the unique issues that Boise is facing as a large city in this state?
I do think it does in some regards. We have to do a lot of, again, education about what we're hearing from our residents locally, what employers are saying about housing, for example, and like where their workforce is able to live or what types of homes they're able to afford, and recognizing that this might not be an issue in your community, but it is one here. I think housing has been an example of this state saying, we don't know that government really should be invested in the housing space. And we're saying our residents are asking us to be more involved in the housing space. Like, we are looking to respond and show that we're listening and that we're willing to engage. And so you have sort of this difference of opinion about the proper role of government and what they think is appropriate. Because at the end of the day, who's going to lose? It's going to be residents who can't find a place to rent. It's a mom who can't afford to pay her bills. It's a family that's, losing secure and stable housing. And we all share a responsibility to respond to our community members in need.
Yeah. Like you said, at the end of the day, the people who are losing are Idahoans. And there's a lot of lip service paid to this idea that the government closest to the people is the best government. But then that doesn't necessarily translate into how the legislature conducts itself. They don't seem to always trust local government if it doesn't align with them.
Correct.
Are there any issues in the upcoming legislative session where you could see a successful collaboration or compromise between the city and state government?
Well, I'm certainly hoping that will be the case in the immigration space. Thinking about, for example, whether there's legislation to compel law enforcement to play in the immigration space, which has long been something the city of Boise and BPD feel very strongly that that's not how you do community policing. It's not how you build relationships. It's not how you build trust. So again, working with lawmakers across the aisle to really understand legislation that creates fear and division in our community. And then what are the economic outcomes of that? The city builds diverse coalitions with other local governments, with the business community, with nonprofits and community groups, other civic leaders in the area. And so we do come with a lot of friends and partners, and then, try and work collaboratively to uplift the same message about inclusion, opportunity, and really, again, true service to our residents in the community.
So, Kathy, if you could craft the perfect legislative support package for Boise, what would it include?
Well, first and foremost, I have to include our geothermal bill and being able to expand essentially how much water we're able to use from a heating perspective to grow our system. We have partners like Boise State, St. Luke's, affordable housing developers who want to engage. So I want to include that one. I would love to see the legislature appropriate money on a continual basis from the general fund into the Workforce Housing Trust Fund, and would love to see a creation of a state tax credit for affordable housing development. That would be an incredible gain in the housing space, and one that's really best suited for the state to play in, that I think would make a lot of our housing partners happy to know that it would just really increase capacity. We have a supply need, and we need to encourage as much affordable housing development as much as possible. Would love to see additional appropriations and transportation investments. The state does not make any investments in public transportation. The city is the largest funder of Valley Regional Transit with property tax revenue. So would love to see some additional investments in the transportation space to really help build out that infrastructure and that need. And then I think just broadly speaking, let's let cities do what cities do best, which is govern their communities and their people. And certainly let's stay away from attacking marginalized community groups too. They create a really vibrant culture for Boise and many other communities, and that's what makes our local towns and cities so vibrant.
Well, Kathy, thank you so much. I know this is such a busy time of year for you, so thank you for taking the time to break that down and discuss these issues with me.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And if folks want to stay tuned to what the city is working on from a legislative standpoint, I do just want to flag we do post generally weekly updates on our website, on our government affairs page about issues we're tracking. So if folks want to follow along with where the city is on behalf of our residents, don't hesitate to check out our government affairs page on the City of Boise website.
Perfect. And we'll link that in the show notes for anyone who doesn't know where to find it.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for your time today.
That's all for today here on CityCast Boise. If you enjoyed the show, you should subscribe to our Hey Boise newsletter to get more 2025 legislature updates. We'll be back tomorrow morning with a look at how to plan the best solo dates around town. Catch you then.